Okay, seriously, why on earth would a coffee grinder need an app? And would you pay $1,700 for it? I used to think that burrs were everything when it came to grinding coffee, and I had this idea that if I could find the cheapest grinder that could house SSB multipurpose burrs, that I'd be set for life. I found it absurd that people were willing to blow thousands of dollars on grinders that had the same burrs as cheaper ones. It just made no sense to me until I started playing with some of these fancy ones. This is the Acaia Orbit, a fascinating piece of gear with some really cool tech built in, and I even had the pleasure of having a long conversation with the co-founder Rex to find out everything I can about it. So here's a detailed breakdown of a very expensive grinder that I've used every day for over a month now. Let's go. Before we get started, these grinders were sent to us by Acaia, no money exchanged hands. They've had absolutely no say in what we've put in this video, and they don't get to watch it before any of you do. They also sent us these lunar scales to test a very cool feature. As always, a huge thanks to Benki Brewing Tools for helping with all of the logistics. If you're looking for coffee gear, then use the link in the description below to get 5% off. It also helps the channel. And one last thing before we get into it is that the Orbit is not new. In fact, it was launched way back in 2022 with tons of hype around it, but has since been forgotten for various reasons. They then went on to launch the black and white version in 2024 that fixed a lot of the issues that the original had. And what I have here with me are the third and latest versions. They've got a new hopper, better dials, multiple changes internally, several updates to the software, and other small tweaks. While I wouldn't go so far as to call it a whole new grinder, it is significantly different and better than when it first came out. Alright, let's dissect the visual design. So the first reaction I get from most people when they encounter the Orbit is, ooh, that looks like a microscope or telescope. And from the coffee nerds, hey, that looks like a Weber Workshop EG1. Both statements are quite accurate. It definitely has that precision lab equipment look to it. Also, the reason it looks like the EG1 is because it was in fact designed in collaboration with Weber, but more on that a little later on. Personally, I think the Orbit is a beautiful looking product. Very sleek with a tiny footprint. The sloped cantilever, the way that the hopper attaches to it, the detail of these bars with the hex nuts, the adjustment dial, the markings on it, and even the font on the dial just all work really well together. The paint job is excellent, especially on the beige white one, which has this lovely texture that scatters the light and is also a joy to handle. And you even have a little spotlight to get a better look at the grounds. Just overall, there's so much attention to detail. But onto some of the things I don't quite love. The catch cup is too wide. Let me explain. While the body is a beautifully textured warm white, the catch cup is much cooler white and not nearly as satisfying to handle. It also doesn't really fit with the geometric design language of the rest of the grinder. These exposed screws on the hopper look very odd. Even the top screw draws a little too much attention to itself. Acaia really screwed up here. Sorry, I had to. These things are of course less bothersome on the black version. The build quality on the Orbit is excellent, both inside and out, and is something one would expect at this price point. It's pretty much all high quality, heavy gauge metal, and even though quite tiny, it's got decent heft. The tolerances on the inside also seem very tight, and it shows in the cup. Here's something that annoys me though. The paint is chipped under these screws. Unacceptable. Granted, you don't notice when it's assembled, but I know it's there. Anyway, let's move on to the user experience and also look at some really cool features that are built into this grinder. Like all products, the Orbit has its quirks, and I will obviously get to these, but overall, it's been an absolute joy to use. The adjustment dial is buttery smooth and so satisfying to move. Seriously, the nicest stepless one I've used. And then there's the knocker. I'm a little embarrassed by this, but I think I may be addicted to it. It's just way too much fun to flick, and it actually works really well. Between twisting the dial unnecessarily and over knocking, I am ashamed at my behavior with the Orbit, so much so that I feel the need to ask for consent. The workflow is also seamless. The dial allows you to set the grind size very precisely, with each tick moving the burrs by 7.5 microns, and because it's stepless, I can even go between ticks, making it a breeze to dial an espresso. On the Orbit, I can hit go, dump the beans in, and walk away to either get milk or fondle the other Orbit, and in that time, it will grind the beans, auto stop once done, and spin the burrs backwards then forwards at 1900 RPM to purge any squatter beans. I can then come back, flick the lovely knocker a couple of times, and we're off to the races. It can even automatically pulse the burrs to power through stalls caused by very light roasts. The pulse feature can also be used to grind short bursts if you're trying to get out very precise amounts of coffee. Very cool stuff, and you'll see this in all its glory when we grind by weight. But that's not all. The Orbit has variable RPM that can be set anywhere from 600 to 1500, And when grinding, it will try and maintain the target RPM by compensating on the fly based on the resistance that the beans are offering. Coming back to that collaboration with Weber Workshops, this constant RPM tech was in fact developed by Acaia for Weber. Most people don't know this, but owners of the EG1 will be very familiar with this behavior. Even fewer people know that Acaia actually manufactured the EG1 for Weber up until some point in 2023. Anyway, back to the RPM tech. Basically, here's what we know. Changing the RPM on a grinder either shifts the entire particle distribution finer or coarser, and or in other cases, the entire particle distribution changes. For example, the Timos Sculptor 078S produces way more fines at higher RPMs. With the Orbit, while I do get a slight shift in the cup profile, what is way more obvious is how much coarser the grounds get when you increase RPM. For example, a 25-second shot at 600 runs about 8 to 10 seconds faster when ground at 1500 at the same grind size. So, given how much of an impact changing RPM can have on the grounds, having tech built in to try and keep this constant can only be a good thing. Most other grinders will operate lower than the set RPM because of the load and then fluctuate down quite a bit. There are, of course, several other factors like tolerances, alignment, angle of the burrs, feed rate, and so on. But I do think the RPM is also playing a pretty big role in what this grinder delivers in the cup. Now, speaking of alignment, it has been excellent on both the units that I have here, and it also maintains this really well when you swap out the burrs. But there is a caveat, and a huge one, so I'll save this for when we talk about the cons. According to Acaia, for both the SSP burrs, the distance between the burr lock, which is where the burrs touch when the motor is off, and burr chirp, where they touch when the grinder is on, should be less than 10 ticks. And for the 33M burrs, it should be less than 15 ticks. Okay, I'll quickly go out of orbit to remind you all to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. It takes a lot of time and effort to put these videos together, and this is the easiest way to support us. Also, a lot of you who watch our videos may not know that ARAMSE is a company, and we also design and manufacture products, one of which is a really unique pour-over brewer called Sophie. We ship across the world, and if you're in the US, you can now buy locally. Scroll down to the shop section below this video to find out more. But now, back to the review. Everything on this grinder is controlled using one button, which changes color based on what setting it's on. Here, let me show you. One press turns it on. Once on, a single press turns the motor on and off. A longer 2-second press allows you to cycle between 3 presets, A being white, B blue, and C cyan. These presets can be tweaked in the app. Long pressing for around 10 seconds will power it off. You also have really useful shortcuts like double and triple presses. You can change these in the app, but I have mine set to purge when I double click and reverse and adjust when I triple click, which is another nifty feature that spins the burrs in reverse at a slow speed to dislodge any grounds and prevent a jam when you're adjusting the grind size finer. Another super cool feature, and one that Acaia markets a lot, is grind by weight. When the Orbit first launched, people were understandably confused as to why a single dosing grinder would need this, but they have since launched larger hoppers. Having such a low retention grinder that can also do very precise grind by weight is amazing for a small cafe serving really nice coffee. It's also great if you're doing a pop-up. At home though, I've only found one use case which is kind of cool, and that is to slow feed until you hit the target weight instead of pre-weighing the beans. If any of you use this feature at home without filling up a hopper, I'd love to know what your workflow is. Let me know in the comments. Setup is pretty easy, and once paired, your Luna will display the RPM on the left and target dose on the right. You can edit these values, and once you hit go, you get a real-time readout of the RPM as you're grinding, just like the EG1. And the flow meter now doubles as a progress bar. So cool. You also have this sick auto start feature where you can just place the catch cup on the scales and it'll auto tear and grind out the exact amount of coffee you want without you having to press a button. Excellent to speed up workflow. And lastly, if you were paying attention, you'd have noticed the pulsing right at the end where the grinder automatically grinds tiny amounts of coffee until it hits the exact target weight. While I don't use grind by weight very often, I love how well it's implemented. Popcorning on this grinder is non-existent because of the angle of the burrs and the internal design of the grind chamber. Honestly, you don't need this hopper lid, but it looks nicer with it on and it does make the grinder a tad quieter. Now, speaking of noise, the motor on this is whisper quiet, and the vibrations are also handled exceptionally well. Even the grinding is really quiet, so I ditched the lid to improve the workflow and designed myself an EG1 style attachment. If you like this and you want to print it for your Orbit, then check the link in the description below. Moving down to the chute, I love the details here. Check this out. It's spring-loaded and rocks back and forth. This is what makes the knocker so efficient, as it's able to jolt the entire chute to knock out all the grounds. The Orbit is messy though. No ionizer here like the newer grinders, so you do need RDT. This spout extender actually helps quite a lot funneling the grounds and reducing a bit of static. And lastly, Acaia claims that this grinder is very energy efficient, and while I haven't had the time to test this, it's nice to even hear a grinder manufacturer talk about this. It's very rare. Okay, so far it seems like the Orbit is damn near perfect for a grinder this price point, but it's got a few flaws. So I'll start with the more minor ones and then work my way up to a potential showstopper. Number one, the magnet on the base on one of the units is a little weak and misaligned. I know, first world problems, but hey, drop this kind of cash and you expect your grinder to be able to control its catch cup. Another minor one is that the chute retains quite a bit of coffee, especially at finer grind settings. I obviously don't need this reminder, but don't forget to use the knocker. Number three, the Orbit has a ton of features, all controlled with just one button. So it takes a minute to learn what all the button presses do and what the different LED colors mean. Number four, grind by weight is super cool, but it sucks that you need really expensive scales to use it. Setup can also be a faff if both devices need firmware updates, and you also need to be really careful about applying these magnetic strips correctly before you can use it. Number five, no anti-static tech in here, so it is a messy grinder. Use the extender, and if it's still bad, use RDT. Okay, let's take it up a notch. I love the auto stop feature, but it can misfire and stop prematurely, which is very annoying. I think I found a fix, and I'll show you when we look at the app. Moving on to number 7. Every now and then the grinder disconnects and reconnects to the Luna. I'm not sure if this is a setting issue or a bug, but it can be really frustrating, especially if you're using the app, as it disconnects from there too. Now, staying on the topic of software, there are a couple of bugs in the app, and I don't love that I need an entirely separate app to do firmware updates. Next up, we have the dreaded stall. When I first looked at the specs and saw a 200 watt motor, I immediately thought to myself, is that enough for espresso at lower RPMs? The answer, luckily, is yes, in most cases. While it isn't as powerful as the competition, I think Acaia have done a good job making the most of the power available and using software features like pulsing to overcome certain hardware limitations. I have had the occasional stall with the SSP burrs, but it hasn't happened post-seasoning. I still do think you can stall this grinder with a very light roast grinding super fine, and you spend $1,600 on a grinder and it stalls. It's pissing off, not gonna lie. And finally, on to the most annoying one, cleaning and alignment. The good news is that it's come a long way since it first launched, but it's still pretty bad compared to the competition. Let me open it up. Remove these 4 hex screws. They recommend using the bow tie pattern to ensure you're loosening them evenly, and carefully pull off the burr housing. Then remove these 4 Phillips head screws and take off the rotating burr carrier, which you can then clean, or go on to remove the burr itself if you're swapping them out. Once that's off, you can brush down the stationary burr or pull off the whole dial and stationary burr assembly, as it's just held on by magnets. It uses 3 positioning pins to maintain axial alignment. Lastly, you can unscrew and separate the stationary burr carrier, but I'll refrain from doing that to avoid a greasy mess. If you do remove this, then they recommend reapplying food grade grease to the threads before reassembly. So yeah, a few more steps in the competition. For example, the DF64 or P64, you just keep unscrewing the dial and you're in. With the Phelos, you open 2 wing nuts, pull off the section, and you're in. Here, it's 8 screws to get in, and there are 2 different types of screws. So a little more tedious, but still not terrible. The thing that really bothers me is how easily you can mess up factory alignment. So listen up. If you open this grinder, make absolutely sure you put everything back exactly the way it was before you took it apart. I mean exactly. Like, mark the rotating burr carrier and the bearing shaft so they line up the same way. Heck, mark all the screws and put them back in the same holes. Just be extra anal. It's a very well machined product, so if you're careful, you'll retain the excellent alignment that you get straight out of the box. Next, if you dare to pull off the dial assembly, make sure that the flat surface is squeaky clean. Like my bank account. Seriously, any debris or ground stuck here will affect the parallelism of the burrs. To make things even more exciting, we have grease back here. And this should not be on anything other than the very tips of the positioning pins. If not, then guess what? You'll f up the alignment. And by far the craziest, and the one that makes no sense to me, is the burr housing. Yes, the burr housing can mess with alignment too. In fact, Acaia recommend loosening these 4 screws and wiggling the housing up and down to fine-tune alignment by listening to the chirp. I don't even know what to say. You can shift the alignment by up to 3 ticks with this method, and that's 22.5 microns. The thing is, it is a very easy way to really fine-tune the alignment, but it's also super unnerving that this part is exposed. I mean, think about it. It gets touched and pushed when changing the grind size or moving the grinder around, and I'm constantly worried that I'm changing the alignment. I just wish that this fine-tuning mechanism was inside and couldn't possibly be disturbed once the housing was on. And the cherry on top is that they casually recommend leaving a zero point 0.1 to 0.15 mm gap between the dial and the housing when you reassemble it. The manual they sent me even has this lovely image with a feeler gauge. Yeah, of course, everyone has one of those lying around. The whole process is a bit clunky for me, and it really pisses me off because of how great everything else about this grinder is. I wouldn't call it a deal breaker, but for someone looking to explore the infinite world of 64 burrs with regular swaps, I would try and get coverage for accidental damage, for when you accidentally throw your Orbit out the window. Well, that wraps up my list of cons, and before we talk taste, let's look at the app. Okay, I hadn't used an Acaia app in years, and the last time I did, it was their brew app, and how do I put this lightly? It was rubbish. So naturally, my expectations were very, very low. I'll be honest with you, I scoffed at the idea of a grinder with an app. I expected it to be super gimmicky, but after using it for a while now, I'll happily admit that I was wrong. There are two things that Acaia have done that really make this whole smart grinder thing work, in my opinion. Firstly, they've put a lot of thought and effort into the UI and UX. It's well designed and quite intuitive to use, in spite of housing some pretty complex features, which we'll get into in a second. The second thing is making sure the grinder is fully functional and easy to use without needing the app. Let me show you. Open it up and hit connect, and if your Orbit is on, this should happen pretty instantly and display this screen. This is the main control screen, and everything is pretty intuitively laid out. The top section shows you the time and real-time RPM with the target RPM mentioned right next to it. If paired with the Luna, you'll also see weight displayed here. Below that, you have three control buttons, one on the left to pulse, the middle one starts grinding, and the one on the right is to purge. You'll see an additional reset button here when it's paired with the Luna. Below that, you have a really cool graph that shows you real-time RPM readout, and at the bottom, you can switch between three presets and a manual mode. The presets are set to 600, 1000, and 1500 RPM, but they can be edited, which I'll show you in a second. Manual allows you to change RPM on the fly using the slider, and you can even do it when the beans are grinding. Tap here and you can edit any of the presets and change the target RPM, target weight when paired with the Luna, and you can even toggle on RPM profiling to set two different RPMs. This is a rabbit hole within a rabbit hole, and I'll post more about it on Instagram as and when I stumble upon something interesting. Once you've edited a preset, just hit save. Last but certainly not least is the settings button. This is where things get very nerdy and you can really get in the weeds and customize the Orbit just the way you like it. Up top, you can set up the action button shortcuts. I showed you this earlier. I love it. Below that, you have some information, but the auto settings are where things get really interesting. Here, you can toggle auto start on and off, which is the automatic grind by weight feature we saw earlier. You can toggle the auto stop and even set the delay time. Like I mentioned earlier, this can kick in prematurely sometimes, but setting the delay time to 8 to 10 seconds has pretty much eliminated this problem for me. You can also set up auto purge in a similar way. This will depend on the burrs, but I've found a setting of 1 and 3 seconds works really well. The default setting of 1 second forward is just too little time to grind even one single bean fully. Auto pulse can be toggled on and off. This is again the grind by weight feature that we saw earlier. I have it set to stop 0.2 grams shy of the target weight and then do 0.02 second pulses until it hits the target weight. As you can see, there are a lot of things you can tweak on this grinder, and they have a proper tangible impact on the workflow. And like I said, once you spend a little time setting it up the way you like it, you never have to open the app again. Love it. Okay, so none of these fancy features and customizations matter if the coffee tastes like crap, so let's talk about what the Orbit delivers in the cup and the 3 burr options that you have when buying it. Also, I'll compare this to a few other 64 grinders, some cheaper and others similarly priced heavy hitters like the Lagom P64 and the Zerno Z1. So when you order the Orbit, you can pick from 3 different burr sets, the Mazda 33M, the SSP LS V3s, and the SSP multipurpose burrs. And the great thing is, having 2 Orbits here has allowed me to do some proper side-by-side comparisons, and here's what I found. The 33 burrs are a little confusing to me. I find it odd that Acaia chose to offer these. If I'm not mistaken, they used to ship with the Super Jolly and have since been replaced with the newer 233Ms. Look, they're not terrible. They are more traditional style burrs and produce very blended cups and tend to downplay acidity and highlight darker notes like chocolate, caramel, and roasted nuts. But there are so many more interesting options available today. For example, the 189D that ships with the Phelos, or in fact the new stock burrs on the DF grinders, are both better in my opinion. I would assume that someone spending this kind of cash on a grinder is also drinking good specialty coffee, even if they enjoy more developed roasts. And I think these newer burrs do a much better job of showcasing the nuances of these coffees while also retaining those coveted characteristics of heavy body, sweetness, and chocolatey notes. Just my opinion, But let's move on to the SSP multi-purpose burrs. These we've talked about a lot on this channel. They do seem to have lost their luster from the glory days of being considered the gold standard of high clarity burrs, but to be fair, they can be very finicky about alignment and seasoning, but I still think they're pretty incredible when used right. You then take it and pair it with a grinder of this caliber, and you unlock its true potential. Listen, this improvement is by no means the same night and day experience that one has when going from a Hario Skirton to a premium hand grinder from, say, Easy Presso, or even a good electric like the Ode. Here, it's much more subtle, but it's definitely there. Now, I'm very familiar with these burrs and I've used them across several different grinders, all anally aligned. The Ode, the DF64, Philos, and more recently the CF64V. And something about the tighter tolerances, better alignment, RPM tech, and the angle of the burrs on the Orbit just managed to squeeze out a little extra, and it's pretty noticeable. The cups are juicier and have better separation. For a while now, my go-to for filter has been either the Sculptor 078 or the DF83 with the larger SSP multi-purpose burrs, and the Orbit is neck and neck with the 83 and even beats it on occasion depending on which coffee I'm drinking. I really did not expect these results. Both filter and espresso have been phenomenal, so I would say if you like high clarity brews and you enjoy light roast, then you really can't go wrong with this combo. But let's talk about the next option and then we'll look at which one you should pick based on how you like your coffee. On to the last option, the SSP Lab Suite. These are based on the Ditting Lab Suite burrs, and the ones in here are version 3s. Hansung, the owner of SSP, took feedback on the V2s and tweaked these to produce a few more fines to make it easier to brew espresso, and I can confirm that these are a lot more fun to dial in. The V2s were painful to work with, and often I would be so close to chirp it would make me uncomfortable. I really didn't like either of these burrs at first. The brews tasted a bit strawy and astringent and really lacked sweetness, which is ironic given the name. But I've owned the V2s for a while now and I know that they need a ridiculous amount of seasoning. So after putting around 4 kilos through them, they got significantly better. And now sitting at around 8 kilos, I really enjoy them. While I prefer the acidity presentation of the multi-purpose burrs with light roast, these still do a good job. And you may even prefer them if you're a little more sensitive to acidity. I also think they work better on medium roast than the multi-purpose, and they're great for milk-based drinks too. This Blue Tokai coffee from MS Estate has been our go-to medium roast for a couple of years now, and the shots have been absolutely delicious with these burrs. When it comes to filter, they do an excellent job producing sweet, juicy cups with a little more chew than the MPs. They are very similar to the V2s with a hair less clarity, but those aren't super clear either. If you're a clarity fiend, then these may not be the burrs for you. In my testing, I found the Lab Suite burrs work really well with naturals and more processed coffees, but they tend to dull the acidity a bit too much on vibrant and delicate coffees. For example, both me and my friend Vaibhav, who's a Q grader and one of the best roasters in the country, prefer this lovely blend from Prodigal when brewed with the LS over the MPs. This delicious coffee from Aviary, though, I think really shines on the MPs. Hopefully that gives you enough information to make a decision, but have you seen the insane number of 64mm burr options? Try deciding which ones to get. It'll make Sophie's choice seem easy. But now, let's look at price, who this grinder is for, and how it stacks up against the competition. Okay, so who should spend $1,600 or $1,700 on a grinder? Well, no one. But for some reason, if you're in the market for an endgame grinder under 2K, then the Orbit is definitely one to consider. Acaia made some mistakes with certain aspects of this grinder and the marketing or lack thereof when they first launched, but a few years on, and I really think it's come into its own. Honestly, it baffles me that it isn't as popular as the Lagom P64. I think it looks better, it's built just as well, and has way more cool tech built into it. While the P64 and the Orbit are meticulously crafted in small batches, the Zerno Z1 is truly a labor of love. It's better built than these two, and you may even see gains in the cup, albeit small. But the problem is, it's near impossible to buy, and I still think the Orbit looks better, although that's very subjective. So yeah, that's grinders in this price range, but what about the ocean of 64mm grinders that you could buy for a lot less money? Well, there are many excellent grinders that cost a fraction of what the Orbit does and are capable of producing delicious cups of coffee. You even have budget 83mm grinders that get even closer in the cup. The Orbit, the Zerno, and P64 aren't grinders that you need. They're grinders that you want. In my opinion, the extra money gets you a more polished product built to tighter tolerances with better materials. You have more enjoyable UX and better workflow and incrementally better cups of coffee. And if that's worth it to you, then go for it. If not, then your DF64 or Ode or DF83 or whichever other grinder you're rocking right now will keep you happy for a long, long time. So to summarize, if you have the cash and you don't intend on swapping burrs too often, then the Acaia Orbit will make you very happy. And on that note, I think it's time this video grinds to a halt. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, brew ARAMSE.